John Niehaus, Director of Program Development for the National Association of Flight Instructors. I'd like to welcome you to this edition to the NAFI 10 Question Challenge, the online video series where I take successful flight instructors, ask them 10 questions, and find out what the keys to success in the profession are that they've found. Today, my guest is Russ Still. Now, Russ has over 20 years of instructional experience. He's a CFII, ATP, and Gold Seal instructor. He's an 8-time master instructor, owner, CEO, and chief instructor of Gold Seal Online Ground School, which was founded in 2003. Russ, welcome.
Well, thank you, John, and I appreciate you inviting me. You've had a great group in the past, so I feel honored to be included. So I appreciate it. It's going to be fun.
Yeah, I'm really excited about this, and personal thank you for letting me borrow your team for the day.
It has been an interesting day. Electronics are crazy things.
So we'll just jump right into it. Question number one, was flight instruction your original career plan, or was it something you never anticipated doing?
It was not in my career plan at all. It didn't appeal to me. I guess I was probably working on an instrument rating, and my instructor said, do you have any plans to become a flight instructor? And I said, no, I'd hate that. I'd hate the job. And he says, I don't think you would. And apparently he saw something in me that I guess I didn't see in myself, because once I did decide to move into that direction, which really wasn't too much of a tangent from what I was already doing anyway, or what I had done in previous careers, it seemed to be the right move. So no, it wasn't in the plans, but it just kind of evolved, and it's been probably the most satisfying thing I've ever done in any of my professional life. And I've been around a while.
Yeah, well, they say that flight instructors wear a lot of hats. I didn't realize fortune teller was one of them.
Well, I would have been a poor fortune teller, but my instructor he was a good one. He saw it.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Reflecting on your instructor skill with your first student, how well do you think you did?
Well, listening to some of your previous broadcasts, I knew this question was coming up, and I've tried to think and tried to imagine, do I even remember my first student? And I remember some of the people early on, but I don't remember who my first one was. So I can't really go back to that, but maybe this might be of some interest to people, the way I kind of got into the flight instructing thing to begin with, after I was already, preparing for my check ride and that kind of thing. So I started flying in the back seat with other instructors. There were a couple of instructors that I really admired. So I started flying in the back seat with them, observing how they did things. And that kind of gave me the ideas on, how to start out as an instructor. So when I went into my first student, even though that was my first legitimate, learner, as they say now, I'd really been working on it for a while. So it felt pretty comfortable. That part I remember. I had a couple of funny stories there too, but we'll maybe morph into them as we go.
Well, yeah, I mean, and that's great practice, because they say that what's the old adage? The flying of the airplane is the easy part. It's the
Yes.
communicating while you're doing it that makes it difficult.
Exactly right. And that's something that I've always, and maybe this is why my instrument instructor pointed out that he thought I would become a flight instructor at some point. I like to explain things to people. I'm not so bad that if you ask me about time, I explain how a watch is built, but I've always been fascinated not about the why things work, but how do they work. And in my own learning, I always tried to figure out what, from an internal level or most fundamental level, why does it do this? And if you take that kind of attitude, even towards learning to fly or for any kind of test, it actually makes it easier to figure out what the answers are, because you understand what underlies it. And this is something that I worked on in my prior life as a developer. We called them programmers back then, but as a developer. And I worked for a Fortune 500 company, and we had to anticipate what our users, what the financial analyst in the company wanted. And you really had to think about, what's this like from their side of things? What are their needs? How do they see this? And that really translates into flight instructing really quite well.
hmm Yeah, and it's one thing to sort of understand, it's another thing to be able to then communicate it back. And just like a user for a program, not everybody's going to use it or understand it in the same way. So you got to be able to anticipate the needs. And that's really where the art form comes from.
Yeah, and anticipation, that's the word. That is a word that's in my vocabulary a lot. Anticipate what the user's expectations or what his understanding or her understanding is going to be. And that takes some special skill. Um, I read something the other day and it mentioned that when a dialogue is going on between two people, most people, and I've certainly been guilty of this, we're listening trying to anticipate what we're going to say next rather than
Mhm.
listening to try to learn or absorb what that person is saying and from there figure out what their feelings are. So, yeah, anticipating the other person is a big part of this equation. And that's why going up as a flight instructor in an airplane, just showing them how to steer the airplane around and getting your time in, there's a lot more to it. You've got to figure out what is it that connects with this particular person that makes it stick. It's a knowledge transfer function, and
Mhm.
that's what I'm all about is knowledge transfer, and that's really the underpinning of this entire company is doing effective knowledge transfer.
Yeah, absolutely. So many of us have had instructor mentor who showed us the ropes. Who was yours, and what was the most meaningful thing they taught you?
Well, I've worked with a lot of great instructors over the years. Early on, I guess I'd been instructing for maybe 6 or 7 years, and I met Jason Blair, who had become the executive director of NAFI, and he and I became friends. And the thing that I remembered about Jason and still recognize is he is such a great communicator. Uh,
Hmm.
he can talk about anything and make it interesting and make you want to listen. I just finished doing a flight instructor refresher clinic, and he was on in some of the videos, and that reminded me how good he is at actually expressing and transferring information to the listener, and that's something that we all need to do better at. I've been very close friends with David St. George and Rich Stoll and Doug Stewart. Uh, Everybody who I've talked to has done has helped me. So I've been lucky to have a lot of these people that I could go to for advice and very well taken.
Yeah, I mean that's a fantastic collection of mentors, and the cool thing about the communication and making it something that appeals to people is also being able to translate it from a single interaction with one person to expanding into a group and being able to do it in a seminar format. I mean, that's just it's a really cool thing.
Yeah, and that's really the broader audience that we cater to is the bigger group. I do a little bit of one-on-one instructing. In fact, I've got a primary student who's got a nice, beautiful 182 right now that I'm working with. But generally speaking, I don't do any one-on-one anymore. I did it for a lot of years, and I learned a lot from the process. But when I was doing one-on-one instruction, honestly, my favorite part of flight instruction was not in the airplane. I enjoyed the grounds portion, the ground school, the one-on-one with a student at a table in an airplane model. I liked that more than flying the airplane. So it's this whole concept about aerodynamics and aviation that I just love to talk about. And what better way to do it than to package it up in some form that someone else can benefit from. So I put a lot
Mhm.
of time into those kind of in-person discussions, knowledge transfer situations. We did, unfortunately, COVID came around, but we started a seminar on engine failures after takeoff, and we were taking that around the country until COVID hit. And that's a different group altogether when you're talking actually up on a stage kind of environment. I remember one of the earlier ones we did it at a big fly-in called Triple Tree. And we had
Hmm.
a big airplane we were sponsoring at the time. So we had a stage set up in front of the airplane and it was going to be at night. So we had all these lights in and I couldn't see a soul out there. So I was just talking to this big black hole, which was kind of a novel thing. Every now and then I'd hear a cat call or somebody laugh or something, but that was speaking to groups is a different thing altogether. And there, your goal is you have to keep them engaged and you have to keep them interested because they're only going to be with you for an hour. And if they're not engaged and find what you're saying compelling or interesting, you've lost them. And that really goes
Hmm.
back to even one-on-one flight instructing too. You have to keep people engaged.
Absolutely. And that segues to my next question of what is the most valuable non-aviation skill you've learned being a flight instructor?
I would say learning to listen better. Goes back to that word we talked about earlier, anticipating. Um, with a student, be whether or not I'm delivering it online in some type of video or pre-programmed format, or I'm in the airplane with a student, I'm a firm believer that you have to understand where that person is coming from. If your goal is to impart some type of information to this person, you have to figure out what works best for them. First of all, what things are going to confuse them? How can we deliver those types of things so that they are less confusing, so that it clicks, so that they get it? You have to anticipate the things that they may not tell you. Maybe they're a little bit concerned about steep turns or emergency descents or something like that. I guess a couple of funny stories about those too. But I would say the biggest skill that I learned was how important listening is, because you can't transfer knowledge or information to someone else if you don't really understand what makes them work. And listening is the way to do that.
Hmm. And even understanding just how they are in the moment. Are they stressed out? Are they tired? Like you
Yes.
said, there's a lot of things they're not going to tell you. And you can sit there and you can try to impart that knowledge, but it's just not going to be effective.
Yeah, it's got to be a conversation between you and your student. It's not a monologue. I'm not dictating a lecture to you as an instructor to a student. It's got to be a two-way street. So you have to absolutely develop some trust. The student has to develop trust in you so that you can have an open dialogue, and that's when information starts to freely flow, I think.
So, what's your most enjoyable thing? What do you enjoy most about flight instruction?
Well, again, it goes back to this idea of figuring out ways to impart knowledge or ideas to other people. Everybody is different. I'm not a minimum standards kind of guy. I think the ACS, for example, are a bare minimum. I don't think we should just try to get a student prepared for a check ride based on what the ACS says and then figured, okay, you've got 42 hours, you've done everything, you're ready to go. I'm a big believer in giving people what they really need to know to operate in a real world environment. And a lot of times that goes farther than what the ACS goes. So being able to push through and give people real world information rather than just what is the strict um, minimum requirements. I think I may have even traveled off from the original question there, but that's where we ended up anyway.
Hey, and that's what this is all about. No, this is great. Now, you said you had some stories. I'm going to hold you to it because
Okay.
what is your favorite scary, fun story as an instructor? Anything come to mind?
Got you. I was watching the one you did with Max Trescott, and that, and he had a couple of funny ones in there, and started thinking, well, I actually do too. Um, one in particular, I guess we were working on. I think we were working on emergency descents. This was a primary student. I was doing. We were training in a 206, so he and his brother actually got their certificates in 206. A lot of instructors told me I was crazy for doing that, but it worked out just fine. But at any rate, the goal was we were going to get the airplane down to the top of the green arc. So, but he locks his arms forward like this, and he freezes there, and he
Oh,
won't let go. I literally had to reach across him and break his arms like that. I mean, he just froze.
wow.
Um, and I have seen this freezing thing happen a couple of times. I was with a student. I was doing transition training in a Cherokee. I think it was a Cherokee 260, and we had an engine failure. Came out okay. But the first thing he did when the engine quit was just took his hands off the yoke and just up in the air, just gave up. And I thought, wow, you're a pilot. You don't ever just throw your hands up and give way, give up. When you have a problem, take charge, fix it. And so those were some interesting stories. There was another one about primaries training that I learned something definitely from, and this may have been my third or fourth or fifth student, and he was soloing in a Cessna 172. And at that point, I was allowing solo students to do touch and goes. I don't anymore for this reason. So he was out there in his first touch and go, and I guess he had either 20 or 30 degrees of flaps in, but whatever it was, he didn't clean the airplane up. He didn't get the flaps up. He put the power in, and the airplane anemically limped off the runway up into the air. And he
Ooh.
got around and everything okay, but he landed after that, and he just said he was terrified, and he never came back. Actually, he came back and flew with me one more time, but that was it. And there's a real moral to this story about having students even doing touch and goes. It seemed to be the expedient thing at the time, get a lot of landings in by doing touch and goes, learn to clean the airplane up. But there's a lot of learning to be had by simply learning to taxi off to the off the runway, talking to the ground controller if you're at a towered airport, going back for
Mhm.
another takeoff. So I stopped doing touch and goes with students unless that I'm actually in the airplane with them. Um, there's just no, it's not worth the extra time. So I learned something from that story. Uh, Poor guy. I wish he would come back to aviation now that had a little bit more instructing experience.
Yeah, but I mean that's a good lesson.
Yeah.
It's kind of the same lesson of not doing stalls with students on their first flight.
Oh yeah.
Whether they're actually frightening or not, people have the word stalls built up in their head as this super frightening thing. And so, regardless of how calmly you're able to do it, you might still frighten them away. And so, knowing that, having to learn that lesson, even if it's the hard way, is a good one for instructors.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. There's no reason on a first, second, or maybe even third lesson to be hitting steep turns and stalls and things like this. You want to make the learning experience enjoyable. First of all, these people are paying us. We work for them, and it's not our job to try to scare the pants off of them. But
Hmm.
for more from a knowledge transfer standpoint, we need to make this a fun, interesting experience and let them work up to those points where they're ready to handle stalls and any kind of things. That stall is such a funny word when people use it all the time. The engine stalled, I hear that one,
Hmm.
but as we all do. But yeah, keep away from the scary stuff early on. Give people the information that they can handle at that time. And then once again, that goes back to that listening concept of try to understand what works best for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to make one more point, and that's I noticed in your first story you mentioned that oh yeah, we had an engine failure, no big deal, turned out okay. And I smiled because that is the sign of a true instructor. Because a lot of other pilots may try to say that same story, and they do it with a lot more emphasis on oh this happened and that happened and we were lucky and this and that. And an instructor just kind of goes well, we did what we had to do. We finished it, and everybody came out okay. So it's a good day. Just thought
Well,
it was an interesting point.
yeah, and don't you think that's probably a good experience or a good way to be around your students to let them know that problems happen. We don't have to go into panic mode. We need to staying calm is a virtue. Getting scared and not paying attention is what you want to avoid. So I think all flight instructors should try to portray to the students that things happen, but we handle them.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, in your mind, what quality or skill makes for an exceptional flight instructor?
Well, I hate it, but I always keep coming back to this same concept of listening to your student, learning about what your student how they respond to things, what works for them. So it's an interpersonal skill, really. I think that's the biggest thing about being a good instructor is to have very, very good interpersonal skills and be willing to accept that some people see things differently from the way that I may see it.
Yeah, the old
Sorry, I
adage
keep
of being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes.
excellent. Yes, absolutely. So that's absolutely true.
So, what aspect of flight instruction best prepared you for what you do now?
Well, I did a lot of writing. Um, it's funny. I've had kind of a, a eclectic background, but I did a lot of writing for technical magazines back in the primarily in the 80s and 90s. I wrote a couple of books, uh, and I liked this idea. It seemed to be the one thing that I had a knack at was putting words on paper. So I like this idea of transferring again information or a concept from one person to another, and it's all a function of how well you can craft your story using the tools you have as a writer. They're only words. I did bring a couple of props here, anticipating this question. I
Anticipation, I
used to
love it.
be, I'm sorry.
I said anticipation, I love it.
Yeah, yeah. We're back to that again. I was a writer back in the early 2000s for a regional magazine that was starting to go national, and I managed to get a lot of the cover stories. Got to do one on Robert L. Scott. God is my co-pilot, and that was a fun one. I was able to interview a lot of very interesting people. Lee Lauterbach, I had flown a few years before with him in Crazy Horse. I'd ponied up for the money for that, but had a great time. So I already knew him a little bit. But this particular article was particularly fun because I didn't even interview him. What I did is I went out and found people that he knew that were well-known aviators. Arnold Palmer, who was a person he originally was a pilot for, and Arnold Palmer was a jet pilot himself. Chuck Yeager, Frank Borman, Kermit Weeks. So I interviewed all of these people for this story, and that's what the story was about. And it made a really varied perspective on what Lee Lauterbach was like. Everybody had excellent things to say for him. Chuck Yeager was probably the least willing to heap praise on somebody, but that was his personality. And then
awesome.
the magazine sent me out to Texas to do an unusual attitudes course, a 2 days course with an outfit that's not there now, on T-34s. And unfortunately, well, fortunately for me, everything went fine. And it made me start thinking about this concept of maneuvering flight and loss of control, which has certainly morphed into one of my bigger things right now, which is engine failures, specifically after takeoff. But interesting story about this, sadly, was this was right before they had a bunch of T-34 wing spar failures. And in fact, at this company that I was at, 2 weeks, not 2 weeks, I think it was about 2 months later, one of the T-34 wings folded up and killed the guy who had been my IP in my training. And then about a month later, the owner of the place, he folded up another T-34. And I think that was actually when they all shut him down. But I really enjoyed putting the article together, and that particular article led me into my main thrust now of this engine failure after takeoff thing and this whole concept of the impossible turn. Every time I say that, I have to qualify by saying I don't like the term impossible turn. If it's impossible, it's impossible. The FAA calls it the turn back, but maybe that's another thing we could talk about on another day.
Sure, sure. So it's kind of a different spin on the same question, but how did you utilize your time as a CFI to achieve what you're doing now?
Well, that's a pretty interesting one. I had worked at a flight school. I'd actually worked at a couple of flight schools, and I'm kind of a go-getter person. So I rented some office space on the other side of the airport. I just went over and opened up shop by myself. I got somebody to do a lease back with an airplane, and I just went into business by myself. But as I mentioned earlier, tend to give a lot of ground instruction to primary, well, for instrument students especially too.
Mhm.
But we always spent a lot of time on the ground, and I just realized that I was given the same ground speeches over and over again. So I said, there's an automation way I can ease my burden here. So I rented the office space next door to mine, and I set it up as a little library in there with a TV and some VHS tapes at that time. But then I also went through and made a whole bunch of PowerPoint lessons with narration in them that people could watch through. And instead of me having to sit to go through and give instruction in I don't know, short field takeoffs, excuse me, I can actually sit them down at the computer and let them spend 15 minutes going through something that's a little bit more polished. And it was just a fact that I was just doing it over and over and over again. Why not find a way to automate this? And my brother, who was also a pilot, came to visit one time, and I was showing him this. He says, "You know what? You could sell that." I said, really? And that's where the Gold Seal Online Ground School came from. Not done as PowerPoints anymore, but that was really the genesis of that. Was I had a problem. I had to figure out how to more effectively talk to people. So let computers help out.
I love it. I love it. Last question. Um, so if you could give a new instructor one piece of advice for success in the profession, what would it be?
I think Max used this same one, and I would agree too. It's specialized. Now, when you're first coming out of the chute, you're a fresh CFI. Obviously, you can't really do too much in the way of specialization. You've got primary students to deal with. You have instrument students, commercial students. It's pretty much the same drill using the ACS. obviously finding better ways to make it work, but doing the same thing. But in the long run, specializing is where probably people find their long term love because they can get into. I mean, there's no reason for. I mean, Gary Reeves is a good example. He's excellent with avionics, and look what he's done. He's specialized in that. The guy is in tremendous demand, and it's because he's specialized and he loves what he does. So I think
Mhm.
specialization in the future, work towards that, is how anybody is going to be really successful and fulfilled as a career flight instructor.
Yeah, I mean, you find what you really love, and people recognize that, and they want to come to you
Yeah.
because they know it's what you really love.
Yeah. If you're enthusiastic, they can tell it. And people gravitate to that. If you're an enthusiastic presenter, people listen.
Mhm. Well, Russ, that's all my questions. I can't tell you how much I appreciate you taking the time today to talk to me. Do you have any final thoughts, or I'd love to hear just a quick plug for Gold Seal if you got one.
Well, thanks. I'm always good for that. We'll try to make it won't make it much of a sales pitch, but Gold Seal was the first company to have an online ground school long before any of the bigger names that people will think of. These guys were still doing sending out DVDs in the mail when we were online with interactive lessons. So we've been doing it longer than anyone else. And the Gold Seal Ground School differs. There's so many of them out there now, but it differs in a couple of respects. One is that we cater to flight instructors. Uh, One of the more powerful features within Gold Seal is that instructors can join for free and they can monitor their students. They have a status page with all of their students on it. They click the status button and they can see exactly where that person is in their training. And for example, let's say an instructor tells his student that next week we're going to be doing steep turns. So I want you to go into section 3 of Gold Seal and watch that lesson on steep turns. Well, next week rolls around and the instructor can say, can take a look and see if he did his homework. So that's one of the big things. The other thing is that it's interactive. Virtually every other programs like this in this space is are videos, and they're very well done. There's no doubt about that. But they really aren't interactive. You start at the beginning, you watch a 7-minute video, and at the end, you hopefully took some notes or something to help you remember. If you want to go back, you have to scrub through and find the spot you were looking at. So our stuff is actually interactive. The student interacts with the presentation. So those are the biggies. So I really would invite anyone, and especially instructors, to come to groundschool.com and create a free account and come be a part of the party.
Fantastic. Well, thanks again.
My pleasure.